Okay, so I just want on record your permission that I'm okay to record this and share it with people.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Also, I want to let you know that I am having some sort of kind of hard-hitting questions, and if at any point you feel like any of these are insensitive, or or there you go, I can see you now. If at any point you feel like these are insensitive or you don't want to answer, please just let me know.
That's no problem.
Okay, so first of all, can you sort of introduce yourself and how you are related or affiliated with any Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the name is Michael Fletcher. I describe myself as a white boy who's been on the Red Road since, well, since about 1970. I'm 65 years old. I started dancing powwow when I was about 15. My introduction to the culture, well, I grew up in Southeast Ohio. I had always been interested in culture. I read a lot, read a lot all the time, but there were just weren't people around to learn from for the most part. So pick up a little bit here and there as I could. Up until I was about 18 and in college, even closer to 20, that's when I started really meeting other people around the state that were involved in cultural activities with Indian people. So my family has some stories about, and some claim to Native heritage, but we don't have enough history to claim any tribal affiliation. So I say I'm a white boy who's doing the red thing and have been doing that for 50 years now. And no tribe claims me. The clan name has been given to me. I've participated in powwow culture in particular. I've had the opportunity to do other things as well, and have not done most of it. But other things like Sundance or just some of that kind of stuff, I have chosen not to. And that's it, really. Since about 20, most of that has been with Native people, the combination of Native folks and non-Native people who are doing the Native thing.
Okay, cool. Well, so what this project is a little bit about is we're trying to find more ways to educate college students, specifically in our environmental school, through different classes, just about Indigenous history, Indigenous way of life, land usage, all those different types of things. And it feels like a lot of the time, history is always told from the settler side, and it's never told from a tribe's perspective. So that's one thing we're trying to figure out how to go about. So I didn't know if you knew of any good resources like books or anything like that that you think would be helpful.
Yeah. I sent you a link that my wife gave me from one of her associates on Montana's program of Indian Education for All. They actually have it in their state system that everybody gets Native, historical education on the Native American culture, particularly for what's relevant to them. And it's been proposed that we should do more of that kind of thing on a nationwide basis. I think it's New Zealand in particular that actually does that with their Indigenous people on a very broad basis. Everybody in New Zealand has to courses in Maori and learn about the history of the Native people and that kind of stuff. We've never done that in this country, except on a spot basis here. But it's been proposed that it should happen. And you're right. Most limited education that does occur through most states is very hit and miss. There's not a whole lot of format to it. You get into the eastern states in particular. A lot of states like Ohio, we don't have reservations here. We don't have. Ohio doesn't even have any federally recognized tribes here, so we don't have much to learn from. Doesn't mean we don't have Native people here.
Right.
In fact, I've mentioned a couple of times a friend of mine passed away now, who was involved in census work back in the 60s, and they found then that about 20% of the regional Appalachian people had some claim to Native American heritage. They had those family stories, but again, it wasn't close enough that they couldn't say exactly what tribe. They didn't know the details, but there was a claim there. And when I've cross-checked it with the tribes' rolls on one hand and the phone book indexes on another, and then for a third, I test in the classroom to see how many when I'm in there ask how many kids, families tell those stories, it's about 20%, very consistent, of Appalachian people that still have those claims. Up until let's see, up until sometime in the 1980s, I believe it was. Yeah, when did that? What year did that come out? Because that was the turning point culturally. Prior to that, in the eastern United States, an awful lot of Native American activity that was going on was actually people like myself who were not Native but were white, but drawn to the Native culture, or maybe some claim, but like myself, non-specific.
Just so you know, your sound's cutting in and out, so it's very hard to
Oh,
hear.
okay. If I have to, I can switch at some point here, but we'll try it. So up through my early adult years and teen years in particular, it was mostly non-white people in the eastern United States that were doing the Indian thing. Now, that's not the same as out west. Out west, you had reservations, you had denser population cultures of Native people, and in some of your cities, you've got that. New York has a big Indian population, as does LA and Chicago. But throughout most of the eastern United States, there wasn't much of that. And then when Dances with Wolves hit, in particular, an awful lot of people in the eastern U.S. who had those claims, but non-specific claims, started coming out of the woodwork. And the question about what happened there, why did that make a difference? Is that prior to that, throughout the early part of the last century, or most of the last century, the grandmothers quit talking about it. If you were in the eastern U.S. and had Native population, it was better not to be known as Indian, because it was thought they'll round you up and ship you off out west, like they did with so many of the relatives. So the eastern people didn't claim it so much. After Dances with Wolves, there was something of a cultural revival for a lot of Indian people who had not been real involved in their heritage all over the place, and in a lot of the cultural traditions, and they started coming out of the woodwork and reclaiming what little bits they know or parts that they could pick up here and there. So what I saw was a phenomenon of we had multiple circles of people in the eastern U.S. One circle of people that were folks like me who had been taught traditional ways, but were mostly white or not claiming a tribal affiliation, but we've been taught by traditional people. You had another circle of those people who were tribal and Indian, and they do their thing with card carrying BIA, card carrying people. And you had another circle of people who were reclaiming that and saying we're Indian, but they didn't necessarily have a tribe. They might claim a tribe, but they're not. The tribe doesn't necessarily claim them. Tribal affiliation is an important issue. And so you had these three different circles trying to do the traditional thing, and that's still going on today. I was mostly with two of those groups, my mother and stepfather and several family members that also got involved in culture after I did, ended up transversing all three of those groups more so in the eastern U.S. And then out west, it was, we went from here to Phoenix, so everything out west in Phoenix was all Indian. For several years, I was one of the half a dozen white boys on the dance floor. I happened to meet some folks when I first moved to Arizona in 1982, that it was actually an explorer post that specialized in the Native American cultural activities, powwow. And one of their advisors was also the secretary for the Central Plains Intertribal Indian Club. And that was an open invitation for me to participate. So everything that we went to out there was all Indian. There weren't any powwows going on that were predominantly by anybody except for the Native people. And it's just a very different culture. I'm sorry, what was the original question?
Just if you had any, I think it was just like if you had any resources, and then you were talking about that. So you were just talking about the places and.
Yeah, I think the link, I sent you a link on
Yeah.
Facebook. I think that's probably a good start. A friend of mine, Indian fellow who was the curator for the Pima Indian Reservation Museum. I asked him if he might consider participating in this today. He thought it sounded like a good idea, but he wasn't able to because he didn't have the uh, computer services to make that happen. But I could offer you a link to him if you want to reach out to him at all.
Yeah, that'd be great.
His name is Tom Jackson. He's one of those fellows. When I moved to Arizona in '82, he was like 17 or 18 years old, and he has been treated as an elder in the powwow circle, particularly among straight dancers, since he was a kid. It was his mother who was that secretary of the Central Plains Intertribal Club. He ended up being working for the Pima Reservation Museum, Cultural Museum, and
That's cool.
their curator for 20 years. Now he's retired, talking about going back for a degree and teaching others on the same kind of stuff.
So I know that a lot of people know about like Standing Rock and all the things happening
Yeah,
with that. Do you know anybody that's been affected by like government land issues in any of your circles?
personally, no, no. I've talked to a lot of folks about Standing Rock. Um, I've got a friend here, Jen Bowie, here in Athens, who did. She was a journalism major and did history, historical journalism certification of some sort. And she did a thesis on not Standing Rock, but on the 1970s. Oh,
One of the other pipelines,
yeah,
yeah.
on Wounded Knee, on the events at Wounded Knee in the 1970s. She did a paper on that. That might be an interesting article. But do I know people that have personally affected by those land issues? Only on a generational basis. If you go back to Dawes Act, every Native American today had any connection to those Indians that were on the reservation in the long term was impacted culturally because the Dawes Act took away so much of what they had as a family or should have had as a family in reservations. Have been trying to gather bits and pieces of it back together ever since. Here in Ohio, we no longer have any reservation land. There are a few little pieces here and there of lands that a group might own, but it doesn't have any federal recognition. And this is something that I would point out. Everybody talks about the Indian people in general. Right now, you've got about 500 nations that are recognized,
Right.
federal recognition, but they are not the only one. You also have across the country, there are multiple state recognized Indian tribal groups, and most of the state recognized ones do not have land, but they still have a legal standing.
Right.
And there's a new one that pops out, working their way through the system every year or two to get another tribe recognized, even here in Ohio.
So do you think there are any like specific events or things that people should like learn about? Like everybody knows about Trail of Tears and stuff, but do you know of any like lesser known things that you think people should research a little more about?
I think it's important that there be some distinguishing made in what we're talking about when we're teaching about Indian history and culture. On one, we talk about the history of all the tribes that were here before the white man came.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're not Indian, you're white. Doesn't matter what color. Everybody. When they talk about it, everybody who's not tribal or not Indian is white.
Right.
And the whites referred to them as barbarians and savages. And for several centuries, they were referred to as barbarians and savages. And it's important to help people understand that all that really meant was not Christian.
Right.
It's not that they weren't cultures. It's not that there weren't civilizations. It simply meant not Christian. And it gave the European Christians, well, they gave themselves permission to just run roughshod over the cultures that were here. In fact, there were some massive cultures that were here prior to that. If you look in the St. Louis area, you're right in the middle of North America. You don't have to go to South America but right in the middle of North America. There was a huge culture that kind of centered out of the St. Louis area, big mountains. So you got that on one hand, and then they talk about the organization of Indian groups, the governmental side of it, if you will. And so you have the way they organize themselves civically, and then you have the way that our government organized them civically, which even today are sometimes in conflict. Because a lot of the tribal governments and the way our recognized tribal system is set up is in conflict to the way that their traditional tribal government would be set up. They're not the same, and they bump heads with each other on a regular basis. So that's the civic, the governmental side of it. And then we talk about the spiritual side of it. Again, over 500 nations.
Right, different tales,
lots
everything.
Of beliefs. There were some unifying factors that were fairly common. This idea of a quote great spirit, but even there's an awful lot of teaching that suggests that even that is a westernization of the concepts that were in place. You had some tribes that were very superstitious, if you will. Some that were very individualistic, and it just this huge spectrum. And then there was also a fairly rapid acceptance of Christianity or Christian concepts along the way, sometimes by force and sometimes not.
Which is sometimes created like a melting pot of like a middle ground between the original. Yeah.
I heard at least a couple of decades ago now that there was one, it was a Native American preacher. He was saying that basically 80% of the Native American population claimed Christianity. But when I look at that a little bit closer, what I see is that more often than not, it's 80% of them claim a connection to a Christian denomination.
Right.
Which is to say that their people and their reservation were subjugated by the Baptists, whereas this one was subjugated by the Methodists and that one was subjugated by the
right, or like is helped out by a church organization or something like that. Yes.
Yeah, which is not quite the same as saying that they are, and a lot of the Indian people I know and talk to, they'll say, yeah, I'm Baptist. Not because they're part of a Baptist congregation or because they believe in the Baptist theology of Christianity, but because that's who their people were subjugated by. That was the traditions that they were kind of forced into. So there needs to be a distinguishment when we talk about those different, spiritual versus cultural and government versus what happened early on. Us versus
So how do you think like the average college student could help or get involved with tribe or reservation, anything like that? I know that there are different committees and stuff in Columbus, but I didn't know if you knew anything that a college student could do.
Most states have Native American Indian centers. Ohio has some up in Columbus.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't hurt to plug in there. Probably the safest place for college students to start with involvement is the powwow. And I'm saying that's where I was introduced. It's not where everybody starts, but
right.
It is a public space that has a certain quasi-spiritual element to it, not like church, but it's a public meeting. The powwow is intended to be the coming together of all the people. I mean, and take it to the extreme that includes the white people as well. You're not welcome everywhere. You can't just go in and start doing whatever you think. You have to be a little bit careful. But it's probably that and the Indian centers are probably the best meeting place. Getting folks from the Indian centers to come in as speakers on a regular basis. An awful lot of college students are not any further along than the high school students.
Right.
A lot of college students still don't realize that there are Native American people, that there are Indian people today.
Mm-hmm.
I thought they were all dead. You know? I thought they were all gone, or I thought they all lived in teepees. They don't understand that there are cultures in place in this country today. They don't understand. Well, I run into this on a daily basis. There's a lot of people that don't understand that there are a lot of the Indian people are still sovereign nations.
Right.
They don't understand the role of a sovereign nation that is within our own nation. That those people are citizens of the U.S. now, but they weren't for a very long time. They don't understand that they are a nation unto themselves and not subject necessarily to the state rules that the reservation was in, that they're a separate government.
Right.
It's been a while back. I have read some stuff that said that the Indian population, Native American population, was one of the fastest growing population census groups in the United States. A couple of reasons for that. A little bit of it's my speculation. One is the birth rate, but I think even statistically and in the census, another part of it is simply the fact that you don't actually have to show tribal affiliation or bloodline proof in order to check off that you're Native American on the census roll. You know, the only ones that where historically we've ever said, oh, yeah, there's a blood quantum factor was
the federally recognized ones.
If you were claiming a tribal reservation,
mm-hmm.
or if you were black. Yeah. And historically, if you were any, even one drop of African blood, then you were black, right? But with the Indian people, the only time that came into play is if you were claiming a tribal affiliation, and the census doesn't ask that. So now you've got an awful lot of people who don't have a tribal affiliation, but they're claiming the Native American heritage, where they might not have done so a couple of decades ago. And even if the census work done for 100 years or so might have simply labeled them as colored people.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know that you said, that you've been going to pow-wows for a long time and doing things like that. Have you ever felt sort of a resentment from any tribally recognized people for a Caucasian man coming and joining or anything like that?
Let's see, the one time I went to the Arizona State Indian Club, that was a little, because I was the whitest guy there. I got some awkward glances at that one, but also made some friends at that. I would say for the most part, no, I've not had any discomfort, but there have also been places I've been told, don't go there.
Right.
We lived in Phoenix, and there was a big powwow event up on the Navajo reservation. And they pulled me aside. They said, "No, don't go there. Not safe to go there."
Because I feel like, from what I've read and heard, is most tribes, as long as you're respectful of them and actually appreciate it, they don't mind you being there for the most part.
Sometimes, yeah. But there's some environments where it's also, there's a certain tendency to be friendly on the surface and then get you off to the side and beat the shit out of you.
Oh yeah, for sure, and it varies, by group to group.
Even in Phoenix, there's what they call the 49, which is the party after the party. You don't hear much about 49s anymore, but after a powwow, the traditional activity was, milk and cookies come out, and the party that goes on. But we were warned in Phoenix, though we might have participated in all the powwows where we were told, don't go to the 49, because it wasn't safe. You would start drinking, there'd be roughhousing going on. That was not good. So we never, and I did that here, but we never did it any of it out west. Here in the US, I'm thinking. There was, I can think of one incident in particular here. There's, and I don't want to name names or the specific events, but there's a cultural event. It's not really a powwow, so most folks wouldn't know the difference. Uh, there's a lot of dance going on, but you don't dance there unless you're a card carrying.
Mm-hmm.
And, uh, and a lot of my family dances. We had 30 members of the family come to dance. And some of the folks that had been involved in that one started saying some nasty things about my family. Basically suggesting that we were just dancing for the money. That was never an issue. So there's still definitely some resentment. And I think that there's probably a little bit more resentment now amongst the young Indian people than what there was even 40 and 50 years ago. That the younger generation is less understanding of this gap that the cultures went through, where in many cases the elders weren't doing stuff, and an awful lot of what continued was continued by people who weren't necessarily tribal.
Let's see. So you talked a little bit earlier about dances with wolves. Do you think that there are certain good portrayals of Native Americans and bad portrayals, and do you have examples from either that you think in film and TV?
I think that movie in particular was one that generated a huge cultural shift. At the time, most of the people of blood were very encouraged and excited by the portrayal that it put together. You hear a little more criticism of it now than you did back then. But I think it did cause an awful lot of people who had not been involved in the culture before to start being involved in it again. Other than that, there's been some really good movies that come out. Not very many of them that go real mainstream, but some pretty good Indian-based movies that come out. One of my favorites was Powwow Highway. If you look them up, there's several different ones. There are awards for Native American movies and awards for Native American movies. I'm not sure what you're looking for there.
No, you're good. I just didn't know if you had offhand any examples with that.
I think prior to that movie, an awful lot of the stuff that came out was still pretty, really a lot of hokey shit that was out there.
Right.
Yeah.
And then my last question for you is, so I know you were talking that there aren't really reservations here in Ohio anymore, or at least federal ones, and there are more out west. A lot of times what I've heard from some other interviewees is that the problem is that people want to stay in their reservation to keep their culture identity, but there are no jobs there. There's nothing in the reservation, so it makes it hard.
And that is absolutely true. You actually find your biggest and densest Indian population segment not on the reservation, but in LA and New York City, and I think Chicago as well, because they go where the jobs are. So you'll find more cultural activities and more intertribal powwow stuff going on in those places than what you will in a lot of others. On the reservation, it's still very rural, very poor, very much like Appalachia, interesting enough.
Right.
One of the phenomena that I've seen, of course, we talked about the 20% mark of Appalachians. Well, there's also this factor about diabetes. And on the Indian reservation, you have about a 50% diabetes rate. interesting enough, that's also true throughout Appalachia. Is there biological reason for that? And is there a connection between the family's claim to Indian heritage?
Right.
Yeah.
Or is it just a lifestyle in Appalachia?
Yeah, I don't know, but I have brought that up with a lot of physician friends.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to look into.
Something to find out.
Well, thank you so much for your time and answering questions and stuff. And yeah, if you have any more people that from tribes or anything else, or any more information, if you could just send that my way, it'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Michael.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
If you have other questions you want to send me, I can think about and write out. Whatever. When is this due for you?
The end of the semester, so like the end of the month. So.
Gotcha. I'm trying to think. Can't think of anything particular going on right now. I would encourage you to contact maybe speak to somebody at the Native American Center there in Columbus.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to Ohio State? Yes?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Are you living right up there?
Yeah. Yeah, I live in Columbus, so.
You know where you're going to go after all of this? After school?
Hopefully, well, I know that I'm moving to Philadelphia for a little bit and going to get some jobs, but my goal is to work in the Hocking Hills area.
Oh, okay.
That's my ending goal, so I'd still be close enough to home, but there'd be a lot of parks in that area. So
something I thought you were started to talk about is although